Our story starts in Berlin, Germany, November 1938. It was the night of broken glass, Kristallnacht. Across the capital city, Nazi hoodlums targeted and desecrated Jewish-owned businesses. And the Taucher family tailor shop, windows were shattered, inventory was stolen, and sewing machines were destroyed. The Nazis then demanded the shop be cleaned up in 48 hours. Despite the impossibility of the task, Julius Taucher did the best he could. Before he could finish, the Nazis returned and forced the family out of their home. Julius was stripped of his title as one of the best tailors in the city and forced to work as a slave on the nearby railroad. 5 years later, on his way home from work, Julius was suddenly arrested. Expecting the worst, his wife, Therese, and sons Fred and Hank fled their ghetto apartment. They were helped by the family's midwife, a Nazi party member and close friend of Adolf Hitler, who had access to a summer cabin designated for high-ranking Nazi officials. Resisting the pressure to conform with the anti-Semitic stance held by Hitler and members of the Nazi Party, she invited the Tauchers to stay at the cabin and supplied them with ration coupons and fake IDs. In March 1945, 12-year-old Fred Taucher was riding a streetcar that was stopped by two Nazi officers. They asked for his Hitler Youth card and berated him for not wearing the proper uniform before throwing him onto the street where he was beaten and arrested. Fred was then stuffed into a cattle car, filled with Soviet prisoners of war, who knew that to lie on the floor meant to not get up again. With help from the soldiers, Fred stayed awake and stood for 2 days before an air raid forced the train to stop. The prisoners forced open the door, and Fred watched as they stormed a group of German soldiers and Hitler Youth during target practice in the nearby field. The Soviets were unarmed, but they were able to overcome the group of Nazis. Taking the Nazi uniforms, they ran off into the forest. Fred dressed as Hitler Youth and hailed down a passing car. Though the car was filled with Nazi officers, Fred convinced the driver to take him back to his family. Weeks later, the Nazis surrendered, but not before murdering Fred's mother in the streets of Berlin. Fred and his brother Hank stayed with the midwife until they boarded a ship for New York City in September 1946. Therese had provided her sons with the best education she could, and despite the circumstances, Fred and Hank both performed well in school. Joining the U.S. Army, Fred was assigned a data processing position on the Korean front lines, but before being shipped to Asia, he spent 10 days at Fort Lewis, south of Tacoma. He fell in love with the area and promised himself he would settle down in Washington after the war. In 1954, Fred was honorably discharged from the Army and granted U.S. citizenship. He made his career in data processing, starting his own company. As an FAA licensed pilot, Fred proudly joined the Civil Air Patrol, a volunteer search and rescue organization of the U.S. Air Force, because people around him resisted hate, Nazi intimidation, the instinct to do nothing. Fred Taucher survived the Holocaust and found a new home and a fulfilling life here in the Pacific Northwest.